Thanks, Christoph. And indeed also thanks to Carol and Simon, and thanks to everyone who is attending here. Please feel free to bombard me with questions or come up with queries or comments in the chat. I'll do my best to respond to them and make it as lively and interactive as possible. I've heard you want me to speak about like 20 minutes, so there is sufficient time of discussion. So I try to do my very best. I have uh, some slides with me, so just bear with me for a second while I'm sharing the screen here. Hope you can all see it. Is that okay?
Perfectly.
All right, then let's get started. Well, as was expressed, we would like to see some perspectives and discuss with you. And that is partly what I'm trying to kick off for the remainder of the afternoon. The opportunities that could come with some economic potentials, but also others. But let me just say one more word about ZMT. I myself joined as a director in January this year after a couple of years in the UK at UCL, University College London. The ZMT itself now has a tradition of round about 30 years. We have some 180 fabulous stuff. And I'm also looking forward to my predecessor, Werner Ekau, in a minute. ZMT is very much interdisciplinary, so I'm not the first economist joining it since 10 years or so. It has a very strong, dedicated social science department, believing that, of course, issues like fishery need both the science, the work on the ground, some data work, some modeling, and indeed some social science. Despite indeed our mission to understand what is going on and the increasing pressure on the marine environment, we increasingly work on solutions because we believe, like the journalists here around us, that this is what is definitely needed, which is also why ZMT is proud of its traditional knowledge transfer, partnership, capacity development, etc. And yes, speaking about Bremen or some of the other non-tropical parts of the world, we've had a Mangrove Future Day a couple of weeks ago. We contributed to what has been in the summer the International Coral Reef Symposium. So that's a bit in a nutshell what we have been doing. But let's stop here for a second. Most of us are probably nervous, if not scared, when we look around these days. Here in Europe, we have a war in the Ukraine and all the repercussions around it. We're also crucially aware of similar conflicts going on in other parts of the world. But we should at the same time also realize that actually cooperation is not there at all. There has been a lot happening this year, actually, when we look at the conference of the parties on climate change, the United Nations Environment Assembly, the ideas that have been floating around. So there's a lot actually where we realize the opportunities are out there. And let me now share this slide with you. Most people look at the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, for the state of science and on the impacts. But actually, there is also a third working group working on responses. And in the latest report, they reveal that actually the opportunities are becoming more and more cost effective, which has to do with successful niche development in a range of renewable energies, meaning the production costs go down, they are competitive, the market share is rapidly increasing over the last years. So what they say now in the IPCC's third working group report is that actually half of the necessary activities to combat climate change are cost effective, which means that we could also say we might be on the cusp of a green industrial revolution when you look at those things. And that is what in innovation research, and I'm quoting a paper here, typically characterizes the beginning of an upswing of those markets. And the question then indeed is, when we look at offshore wind here as but one example, whether this is also something marine renewable energies, where our perspective on the ocean might also potentially be able to tap into. There's another story I would like to share here with you. Most people believe we are unavoidably we're coming closer to 3-4 degrees global warming. That's actually just one way of looking at trends. When you look at the pledges that have been made over the last very few years after the Paris Agreement, and in the last 2 years with the COP26 and the COP27, you realize actually, if you add it up, we will properly be able to meet a 2-degree something target. So actually the gap is still there, but it is less dramatic than it might appear in a public perception where you typically think we are unavoidably going into a catastrophe. That's not the case if we take indeed those commitments seriously. And indeed, that means our task as researchers and the task of journalists and the many others here is to take those commitments seriously and track and monitor and assess what is actually going on. So that is also then the window of opportunities, in my perspective, to look at the ocean climate nexus. The time to act is indeed now. If we wanted to go further to reach a 1.5 degrees Celsius target on global warming, that requires, in my view, the inclusion of ocean as a sink for carbon, as a thing for other greenhouse gases, because the ocean is basically our friend. It is absorbing so many greenhouse gas emissions. It acts as a buffer for heat. At the same time, the ocean is also very much the target group, if you want to say it this way, for biodiversity activities. There has been a commitment, a region pledge, to put some 30% of the ocean surface under protection. Still, the areas need to be defined. And of course, there is also something where we all together can make a difference. We've also seen this year the negotiation on an ocean plastic agreement starting, which also means there's a tremendous activity to engage and raise voices on what actually can be done. So really there's plenty of open doors to engage with. Which leads me to the topic of a blue economy, or a sustainable blue economy, as I would like to call it. If you count it together, all the ocean-based activities make up for the 8th largest economy in the world. So certainly very, very significant. And it's very likely to increase, if not double in size, over the next years, via all the sectors that are involved in this blue economy, which is fishery, food, tourism, etc. But of course, some of you would correctly ask, is this all sustainable? Of course, it's not. So you need a sustainability profiling within the blue economy with stronger stewardship aspects on marine resources, while indeed looking at how natural capital is development. You need to look at the livelihood perspectives and then focus more on the SDGs, on sustainable fishery and food, on sustainable energy, decarbonizing shipping and the like, which suggests there should be a strong definition of what a blue economy is about. And actually, there are many floating around, and some of them might be seen as dubious, questionable. Here's one that I particularly like and would like to share with you, which is from the International Resource Panel, published 1 year ago. Going as an ocean-based economy, and then you see the keywords on equity, social and economic benefits, current future generation, while restoring and protecting the intrinsic value and functionality of coastal and marine ecosystems, and is based on clean technologies and circular material flows. To me, this is a very comprehensive definition. It captures quite a lot. Happy to discuss whether you might be missing some aspect. So it really goes into the different dimension of environment, the social dimension, and the economy. To me, it also means it would need to be an economy that is based on principles. And yes, when we look back in the sustainability literature over last years, if not decades, there are a number of principles that have been formulated in other areas of resource governance. You see the environmental principles on carrying capacity, maximum sustainable yield, life-supporting ecosystems, and then a number of instruments that help measuring how those principles can be safeguarded. Like on the environmental side, the footprints, the material footprint, the carbon footprint, the water footprint. Well, data is available and many activities, product groups, actors can be tracked. And reducing them is indeed of utmost importance when you work towards those principles and with those principles. And we could go on the side of the economy, the social side, the enabling condition. Those principles are definitely essential. And you might have a chance to read through all of them after our seminar here. So are there estimations on what the shape of a blue economy could look like? Yes. Some people did this sort of number crunching, and you also see headline news in the investment magazine, for instance, on those uh, propositions that have been launched by the high-level panel on the ocean, where basically the message is that, yes, on the sustainability dimension, mangroves, which is also another topic this afternoon, the decarbonization of international shipping, food production, fishery, algae, non-fish, marine food, and yes, offshore wind energy production are very lucrative investment opportunities with a very positive rate of return on the investments, which is also then indeed pointing to the fact that it is not just about the SDG 14, but actually about addressing simultaneously a number of those SDGs on overcoming poverty, addressing hunger and food issues, and the others. And this here has been a nice illustration of how many of those synergy exist in those key pillars for action. If you do those things, you typically have a number of legal aspects to consider. Property is a touchy issue, and some of you may have been looking at the law of the seas and the ideas that had been established there a while ago. The point I wanted to make here is a common responsibility, including the economic zone surrounding the countries. And then indeed, if we keep the principles in mind, one could think of a common heritage of mankind legal principle here that could be connected with a number of the other principles, and that would make national actors stronger, accountable for the activities they are planning, and some of them are less sustainable. When you think of all the current activities currently on offshore oil, offshore gas, we would think, wait a moment, that's not aligned with climate change commitments. With those principles, you would have a stronger ability to hold them accountable towards future generations and indeed environmental principles. So there's more even, and that is what you see emerging, but it's not yet quite accounted for. It's a blue carbon aspect, which is that a number of those ecosystems absorb, capture carbon. There's more that can be done here. Eventually, it's 3% of the global reduction in total, which is an equivalent to the German emission, so quite significant in a way. But it indeed means that we need to have more data, more science on how that actually works and how long the carbon can then actually be stored. And that's a bit tricky because right now we see a strong move from corporate actors. And I'm quoting here Microsoft, for instance. They have a carbon offsetting project with Pakistan. So it fits into companies' pledges, but the methodology is still relatively vague, which could then indeed lead to greenwashing, maybe even to carbon colonialism. So definitely activists, NGOs, journalists, watch out what sort of pledges are done and how it can actually be monitored. And indeed, who is taking then actually the advantage. So that's definitely something that is in the next few years, an area where we all need to work together. Fortunately, there's good data available from a number of databases that have been tracking activities over the last years across industries, across countries. Interestingly, voluntarily, industry reports, and I'm quoting here just the CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project, where you really have exciting data from researchers' perspective to compare with what is individually reported, to then have some benchmark to see trends, etc. So definitely, if you wanted to do some of those data analytics, I would just encourage you to take a look here. So let me just quickly run through a number of slides on natural capital. I would believe, being like a bit data obsessed myself, there's a lot that can be done to work towards a better understanding of ecosystem services. The essential point here would be to look beyond the provisioning function, to also look at the regulating function, the cultural function that marine environment has, and include the supporting function, which is really more the deeper layers, the deeper understanding of how nature really, really works. That is as categories established, and it could then go into ecosystem assessments. I recently saw what South Africa, for instance, has been doing, how they started more than 10 years ago, and how advanced they are now in not only doing ecosystem biodiversity assessment for South Africa, including the surrounding ocean base, but also to communicate those results effectively. And what I wanted to share here, based from some UK experience, is that you typically have different units. And one of the great progress areas in research in the last years has been that people communicate when there is a monetary value. It is not the sole value of an assessment. You can combine it with other quantitative data, like on health, or semi-quantitative indicators on the individual perspective of prosperity. And you combine those with accounting, with ecosystem services attempts. So based on those things, you can then start developing scenarios. You might include some sort of, say, catastrophic scenarios, which are not unlikely, unfortunately, but you can also add ambition to scenarios and develop mission for a sustainable ocean, for sustainable energy provision, and the like. And there are a couple of methods and papers indeed that could help establishing those scenarios. So making here the point on ocean accounting, that is definitely something where we have this platform established. They're still relatively young. I would definitely be happy to see more support or volunteers. What is called here the pilot projects has started. But what I learned from those projects, in particular the one in South Africa, is that they are like not really in full swing. So there's still a range of activities that will be needed to really go through the development and then have ultimately a fully available sketch of those ocean accounts across countries. Leading back now to the blue carbon story, one of the essential findings of the last years has been that because the carbon science is still not yet fully mature, what can be measured are all the other co-benefits that quite often occur at the local scale when you do mangrove reef restoration, for instance. So that is essential to keep in mind, that with it, ocean accounting is actually also an opportunity to have all the tangible benefits for local stakeholders on a table, and then indeed have new negotiations, deliberations about how investors could have the longer term returns by investing in it, by not by banking the benefits on their side yet, but happy to discuss a bit later. Let me spend one more minute here on ship recycling. That is a case with some horrible evidence over the last years of how ships actually had been crashed and beached and are demolished. But you would think that not just from a decarbonizing perspective, but also from a green steel perspective, there's more and better ship recycle opportunity. So to me, the essential movement would be for shipping that they're not just exchanging the fuel and make it less carbon intensive, but also look at the fleet recovery and fully recycle the steel that is in the existing fleet, and then provide scrap steel for construction purposes, or eventually also the new fleet would then be running on green steel. That is an issue that indeed requires also some international collaboration so that a race to the bottom would be avoided. Plastic is an issue here. I published a bit. I'm also happy to discuss what sort of expectations some of you might have on the plastic agreement. I'm coming to an end here. I wanted to share my perspective in general on a blue economy with all the faces it has for the risk, but also for the opportunities in involving local stakeholders. Definitely from my perspective as a researcher, it needs full accounting of all ecosystem services. We can also work together on transformative pathways for coastal communities, but also for the regions and nations they're located in. And yes, we would also need to have a word about justice here and international solidarity. A word of warning here with all optimism, the trend is still not our friend, even with a global warming of, say, 2 degrees Celsius, which would be the sort of perspective if the commitments are being delivered. Some ecosystems will be at risk, like a coral reef system. Their tipping point is currently estimated at 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. So we will have to work in a way and on restoration opportunities for those ecosystems that are at risk, even if the global warming will be relatively moderate. But you also see here, Coral Vita and others, they have been doing some environmental engineering, nature-based solutions. So the question then would be, if that works at a pilot demonstration scale, can it eventually be disseminated and upscale? So to me, that suggests we should have like a dual strategy of moving forward with the opportunities that exist, but definitely also keeping an eye on what goes on regarding some of the less friendly trends, which to me ultimately suggests a pluralist approach, awareness rising behavioral change, and looking at the agenda. I'm in particular also pleased to see some arts being involved here, and I look forward to other presentation and contribution here. I think I can stop here. Thank you, definitely very much indeed. If you wanted to go deeper, we just published a Marine Social Science Manifesto at the Earth System Governance online website. So thanks a lot again, and happy to deepen some aspects, respond to questions. I didn't have a chance to look into the chat because of the screen sharing, but happy to do it now, or indeed just respond to any query that might come up. So thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you very much, Raimund, for this really broad picture which you presented here, and this very impressive introduction to the topic. Yeah, I mean, now the floor is open for any questions or comments. So you can just raise your hand and then post your question here. Not in the chat, you can do it directly. Is there anybody who wants to start? If not for the moment, perhaps I have a question, a very general one. So if we talking about the blue economy and sustainability, doesn't it mean that we have to change, let's say, our perception of economic growth, and yeah, which is, let's say, the dominate philosophy in the field of economics, and yeah, or do we have to limit our consumption and also our growth?
Fundamental question. Thanks, Christoph. we definitely have to rethink what pattern of growth paths we have been on. It's been unsustainable. So clear response, yes, definitely. We have to review and change. Does it ultimately mean less consumption, less growth, eventually degrowth? I'm not sure, because ultimately what GDP is about is a prosperity indicator. It measures economic activities in monetary terms. So if people change their consumption, if there is more demand for renewable energies, for electric vehicles, etc., this also means GDP growth. So we will have a mixed composition. And what I've been doing in some modeling exercises is that actually we can dramatically reduce our footprints on carbon, on materials, etc., while at the same time also still having growth in education and services, including social services, in some fancy environmental technology. So it's really not straightforward, and I would not be on the same side with proponents of a degrowth, saying that we all have to tighten the belt, we have all to consume less, and the result has to be a degrowth. No, it's not quite that.
Okay, thank you very much. By the way, I always like that you mentioned the constructive aspect in your presentation, so that there is always a solution to any problem we are facing. Yeah, questions? There are no economists, or what is the reason why there are no questions?
I hope I was not too economics heavy. I didn't come up with equations or those things. No, I mean, my approach to economics and social science is also very much an interdisciplinary one, as you probably have seen.
Yeah.
I strongly believe in the collaboration with science. And indeed, when you look at assessments of how, say, mangroves could eventually be restored, the investment opportunities, they need a proper ecosystem-based assessment. And that also then includes many of the tricky questions of how carbon can be restored with the sediments and the like. I'm stopping here because there's a question coming up from Alexander.
Yeah, please go ahead, Alexander.
Yes, I have a question, and I would like to know if you would say that these economic solutions are underrepresented in media, and that there's like not enough work done to basically tell the people that these solutions exist, and that green solution can be like also cost effective.
Not being journalist myself, just being a sort of a geek when it comes to news and reading, online platforms, newspapers, I would say, yes, they are underrepresented. For instance, when the latest IPCC report was presented, the media attention that I perceived was, oh, is it 5 to 12 or 5 past 12? So very alarmistic. And that was indeed based on the Working Group 1 report, which is about science, and the second working group about the impacts. And you have all the sort of newspapers about like the Greenland ice melting faster than previously assumed. That's all correct. But I really wonder why success stories on renewable energies are not more publicly debated, including the community-driven developments, including what's going on the side of, say, technologies here, or the growth of companies, what it also means for like an industrial country like Germany. I come from a region that previously was dependent on coal mining, and it's now still an energy producer, but they are more involved in the production of supply for renewable energy. So this transformative aspect is, to me, at least as important as any, say, good news per se. Really going in depth on what people have been through, how industries have been turned around, the stories of change, how, say, the owner of a small company decided to change the business model, all those things would, in my perspective, yes, be very interesting to read. So I would hope that Constructify becomes a massive movement in media in the future.
Yeah, But it seems that we are more or less in line with you, that we also think that that's in the kind of underrepresented in the media, and that we need more success stories. And that doesn't mean to paint a pink picture of the future or so, or of the reality, but at least to encourage people and to say, yes, there are options and there are solutions and there are opportunities where we can go, and to bring them on the floor or to the public. So that's, from our point, very important, and somehow a task for constructive journalism and for media itself. I just read today in a post on constructive journalism at the radio station in Hamburg, NDR. They had a constructive journalism day, and there was one conclusion that constructive journalism should be a kind of, let's say, regular journalism at all. So like a strong journalism in itself. Yeah, further questions? I mean, I have another question, which is a bit perhaps more detailed. You mentioned renewable energies and wind energy. How does it play a role in the global south already? I mean, here in the northern hemisphere, for us, it's a big issue in the meantime. But what is the situation in the global south?
It is emerging, but emerging also means it's not yet quite there. I think it has a number of reasons. I've been to South Africa lately, and the word I heard quite often is corruption. Corruption in the sense of that this is a country that has lots of coal endowments. And of course, it's a cheap domestic energy supply source. But at the same time, there are also vested interests in giving the permissions. So the question of how you change, if there is a country that has domestic endowment, which happens to be the case in like India, in Indonesia, now the recent discoveries around the African coastline, where you have like many countries now being open to accept, let's say, a bribe from international investors to then explore. So that is an issue where journalism might also play a role. The other side is that quite often you need technology transfer because you don't have domestic suppliers for renewable energy technologies. So the question of an open trade system, but also a question of partnerships, because many companies are actually happy to see the good production conditions, and then they would offer the investment, and the return would be to contribute or have a long-term supplier contract with a national or regional government, and then indeed set up and run those facilities.
Okay, thanks. There's a question from Modestus. I hope I pronounce you rightly.
Yeah, you pronounced it correctly. Thank you very much for organizing this program. And I would want to ask a question, bordering on some of the challenges we are having from this part of the world. My question is for developing countries with a potential blue economy. I'm wondering on what role can the media really play, or how can we use through the media to educate people in the hinterland as to the need for a sustainable blue economy? Coming from my own background, in the Niger Delta part of Nigeria, we usually have the problem, those of them in the hinterland are poorly oriented and educated as to how best to use the oceans and all that. So I'm wondering, is there any way, or are there any hints that can be given here that could be of help? I'll be very grateful if there will be a good answer to this. Thank you very much.
I would think it starts with a proper accounting of what the damages are that are in the current system. And in Nigeria, you would think of this oil economy, the oil exports, and all the damages that has been done to local ecosystem, how very little there's a trickle-down effect to the local people. For instance, there's no refinery yet. And Nigeria, people are smuggling gasoline back to their country. So that is in itself one of the difficulties of the current system. So one role for media to display proper information on the risk and damages. And then on the opportunity side, I would think, yes, the opportunities around fishery, around ecotourism or sustainable tourism, also some changes that have been discussed around Lake Chad, so the river and the inland seas, to me would also be very relevant to display. So make it, I would probably think, as local as possible, because many people in Nigeria and other developing countries, they're a little less interested in the global success story. They would like to see it downscaled to their regional context.
Any follow-up question from your side, Modestus? Or?
Thank you very much. That would be all for now.
I mean, you mentioned carbon colonialism, as we called it, and I think that's a very important and also difficult issue. Talking, for example, about the energy sector in South Africa, they have really strong fossil resources, and particularly coal. And now the northern part of the world is coming, the developed part is coming and say, please stop that and go to wind energy and or to rather other renewable energies. And I think the perception there is somehow that's also a kind of colonialism. We are dictating then what they have to do. How do you judge this in the, let's say, in the context or against the background that we, on the other hand, definitely need something that they go away from this fossil energy carriers?
It needs to be like a partnership approach. If someone from the north would come and try to give good advice, it would start with a confession: we, the north, have been doing wrong and caused the problem. And we just warn you that some of the paths we did should not be the failures of your future. So it starts with a sense of modesty. At the same time, South Africa, like many countries, actually, they have a broken electricity system, to say the least. They have had shutdowns over the last 10 years or so. So there is no permanent supply of electricity to the people in South Africa. So there needs to be a proper assessment of whether coal can deliver or whether the electric utility and the government can deliver, and actually it can't. And that means there is a supply gap. And where would the additional supply come from? Then I would think you don't need to be a world-class engineer to see that with this amount of land and the wind that is there permanently, there is a vast opportunity for onshore wind energy in South Africa. I think the analysis has actually been done. There are excellent universities and energy consultants in South Africa, so the papers are there. The question is then more practically of who is investing, who can. Is it the well-known Das Gupta family? Is it an international consortium? And how does it play out? The offer that now has been made to neighboring Namibia to start with concentrated solar power there and transform it into ammonium and then export it to countries like Germany is a nice try in a way, but it definitely points to the need that energy is for the local people first before exports can be done. And then if there is a surplus, yes, that might be something where advantage might be taken. But also the sort of benefits I mentioned before, the blue economy, etc., would need to be for the people. And that means for the local people first. So set up an energy system that works for a growing population, for a young population, for an information-thirsty information that needs energy for digital devices, etc. So that would be my priority.
Yeah, you outlined already what, let's say, what has to be done, and how would you, let's say, on the very practical and concrete level, how would you describe that? Is there already a kind of very, let's say, positive dialogue between northern and southern countries? For example, if you take the example of South Africa, for example, Is that there, or is that more confrontative?
It's mixed. I think when you have a global forum, it's quite often more confrontational, partly also because Northern countries share their success stories. And it sounds like an allegation. Look, if we have done it, why shouldn't you be able to do it? I think it's not intended to be that way, more really to exemplify just what has been done. So partly is really like the perception and the way of how those global dialogues are taking place. But I guess when you come closer to more bilateral expert fora, then it is more tuned down and more practical. And for instance, South Africa, there is an existing energy partnership. My understanding this is more working level. People have a good level playing field, and that is more practical. Then the question is more, how are the results there communicated? Because they often are meeting behind closed doors exactly because they don't want to be seen in this sort of heated public debate. So it's really, to me, a challenge for journalism, not to follow the official fora, but really to have contacts to people in those expert circles and then find a way of participating in their dialogue that often is more constructive. It is then possibly not headline breaking news, but a continuous follow-up to what is going on in these fora.
I think that's a very good recommendation for us and for journalists in general. Yeah. Yeah. We have still a few minutes if we need them. Are there any questions or comments?
If there are no, just as a sort of a practical suggestion, it seems there are more journalists here, which is good. I think the sort of short stories of how people handle a situation, when you go to like a wind energy pioneering farm and all the challenges they face, do an interview, make the faces seen, and talk through their ideas, their visions, but also their practical challenges. That is, to me, a good story, a good podcast. It can be done in just a few minutes. And I think it's really like worth listening, and many people would probably be interested in it. And indeed, from my more researcher perspective, if you could add some data, do some more generic analysis, that's always then highly interesting.
So great. We will hire you next time for the for our media
I'm not very
workshop.
good in doing. I'm not very good in
actually,
doing
I'm doing.
I'm pretty sure you can do it much better yourself.
Actually, I'm doing the seminar at the university with media students, and we are exactly doing that together with Simon's EU project Face It, which is on polar research, where we try to give everything a face and to translate their pretty complicated messages in something which can be understood by a broad public. So I think that's a very important way, and I think you have a really good feeling.
Definitely, yes. I can tell people a secret here. It's warmer in the tropics than it is in the Arctic.
Yeah. And of course, I think also events like today that we got really, as media people, get in direct contact with people like you. I think that's really important and really highly appreciated by us. Okay, a question from Ajit.
Hi. First of all, sorry, I was a bit late to join the presentation. My question is slightly different from the discussion that's been going on. You're talking a lot of these global issues as well as global interactions. I just want to bring a question which I heard a few weeks ago when I was in South Africa. We were sitting in a meeting where it was a local issue, but the issue was quite relevant, I think. The discussion was between converting a coastal floodplain to an industrial estate. And the question was between jobs versus sustainability, right? So when such a discussion happens, barring aside all the other discussions related to corruption and all the other things, there was one fundamental question which was still there. There is the immediate benefit that the people who have been not having enough jobs or all those hardships versus we're talking about sustainability. That's we're talking about 2030, 2050, 2100, and so on. So when we are faced with such a question, how do we respond to it? Because it's also an economic question. It's also a sustainability question. So how well can we address the current challenges? And not, because if we don't address that, no one's going to think about 2050, right? So how do you handle that?
Yes, I mean, that always comes up. And it's been a bit of a knockout argument years before. Oh, there are the jobs. What jobs can you guys deliver, right? I think you need to question the data that is thrown at you, the magic number of jobs that are likely to be delivered. Quite often, it turned out that half of the jobs was there. And after 5 years, the investor pulled out eventually. So really, like, be a bit more bold when it comes to claims made by developers and say, look, half of it might be true. Then indeed also look at the risk at the same side. Are there immediate threats to the local environment? Do they have a proper health and safety plan? That typically arises the costs, and they are a bit more cautious about those things. If there's immediate evidence on pollution, on health and safety risk, you also say, wait a moment. Then the third question is on the location. Does it need to be there? If it is a hotspot of biodiversity or other natural values, you would say, look, there are plenty of other sites along the coastline that could eventually be chosen. Show me, please, your environmental impact assessment. Show me the other alternative sites you have been investigated into. So there are, I think, ways to deliberate and at the same time also start thinking more progressively about jobs that can also be provided by soft tourism. Like in South Africa, when you go around the Eastern Cape, they are now more flourishing around the safari type of tourism with jobs provided there, typically for locals. So I think the bottom line is really not that bad for the environmental side. And when you also see what other countries have been doing, more jobs in clean tech now than in brown tech. So yes, I think you can argue and you can really make your case that a more sustainable development is also one that provides jobs and income.
Okay, thank you very much. Is there any question? If not, then I think we are totally in time, completely in time with our session here, first session. Many, many thanks, Raimund. I think that was very great and informative, and really we learned a lot. And so I think we have also somebody who will be on the side of the media and support media in constructive to report in a constructive way, and that's good to know. Yeah, so thanks again, and we will see you later in the panel again.
Okay. Thanks from my side, and indeed, well, all the best. See you later.
Yeah.